royal event. You see, I'm seeing the patterns that other people are not seeing in political world. And this heated up at the time of Desert Storm. And then coming across the great American teachers who were experts on this, then the journey really began for me. And one of those people, of course, was the famous Jordan Maxwell. And in my astrotheology book also, I partly dedicated it to him. And as I said, back in Ireland, with my colleague Jim Cairns, we looked very deeply into that very sinister stuff about Satanism, cult activity, the royal connections, which is very fascinating, the ritual murder aspects, again, the more sinister side of these networks. And in Program 2, next time we meet together, we'll be looking at that. We'll be looking deeply into that and naming the names and taking the lid off that particular network. That particular network is not the highest, of course. Right? It doesn't occupy the highest part of the pyramid, which is where my main focus has been. It's slightly lower down, but it is very powerful. It has a lot of dominion, a lot of power, and we need to look at that when we're studying these subjects relating to symbolism. But as I said, when you go around looking at churches and you're finding these symbols like inverted pentagrams and whatever else, you start to have very serious questions about what's going on. If there was a sort of downside, it was because then a person who's studying like this finally discovers that, look, the rest of the world isn't even remotely interested in what you're studying. So it can be that can be a challenge for people in the beginning stages, of course. But the thing is that you continue, because what can you do when you know that you're being sold something rotten? Give up? Swallow it? Well, that's not my way. What else do people do? They get angry in a sort of a more negative way. They react as opposed to respond. And of course in this game, that plays right into the hands of your rival or your adversary. What else can people do? Drop out. Cop out. And boy, aren't we living in a culture that just lays that on for us? You need but ask. And every kind of preposterous, obscene distraction is made available. But if you're really serious and you realize that it is a matter of your choice, like David Icke has always said, you're going to step out of that square or not. Well, the sheepdogs are going to try and keep you in. But ultimately, it is your choice. Staying within the consensus is your choice. Or you can take another road if you want. But it requires a certain level of courage to do that. But you can bet that you won't have too many fans, right, when you take that road towards the truth. As Machiavelli said, there are 3 classes of intellects. One which comprehends by itself, another which appreciates what others comprehend, and a third which neither comprehends by itself, nor by the showing of others. The first is most excellent, the second is good, and the third is useless. So let's take a metaphor for a moment. You try to tell people that there's a black lodge operating in the world, or there's various levels of conspiracy, or you get into the questions of consciousness and all this philosophy. My God, you're losing people. They don't even know what you're talking about. In fact, you're half protected that they don't drag you like Giordano Bruno down to the local square to put a nail through your tongue and burn you at the stake, because they're so lost they don't even know what you're getting at. You're saved by their ignorance. But let's take a metaphor for a moment. What happens if you had come to people, say 100 years ago, and said, oh, guess what, guys? There's a whole subatomic, unseen, invisible ecology out there full of bacteria and viruses and tiny creepy crawlies on the top of your finger and in the cheese you're eating. Giordano Bruno time. That had taken you right down and immolated you, garroted you. But what happened? Somebody invented a microscope. And with a simple invention of a relatively simple instrument, suddenly, it's a no-brainer. It's invisible, but you couldn't see it with your 5 senses. But with a single little instrument, you can. And suddenly, it's all clear. So how much do we really know? Now, of course, when you see these other things, these other realities, it's not so much a physical instrument that you use, it's your intuition. It's your imagination, if you have one. It's pattern recognition time. It's Sherlock Holmes time. It's forensic science time. You start putting the pieces together with great love, because if you don't do it with passion and love, you're never going to get there. If you do it from fear, like most people are doing, and do it from trepidation and paranoia, you might as well not bother. But there's simple things. What do we really know? Do we know that the word hello or hey, hey son, is actually a word that used to mean serpent? Do we know that the orbits of Venus and the Earth together make a perfect five-pointed star, a pentagram in the sky? Which is why this symbol was used in magic for hundreds of years, if not longer. Do we know that the guitar, and certainly the harp, and certainly the Celtic harp, the tunings of those harps, including the piano, by the way, are connected exactly to the Hertzian frequency of the movement of the planets? And that in the early days of the Druids, each string of the harp was tuned differently to a different frequency of a different planet. Do we know, for instance, that the so-called Hebrew alphabet of 22 letters, and the vowels were considered sacred, do we know that those in fact are not anything to do with the Jews or Hebrew, but they were actually created, they were shadows cast by a crystalline pyramidon that used to sit on top of the Great Pyramid. And when the sun at its full beam, which is Ra to them, remember? When God's light shone through this crystal, the high priest would notice the shadows that it cast, and then in transcribing those particular shadow forms, the 22 letters, the sacred letters, were formed. Which would then went on to be involved in Kabbalah and magic and many, many other mysteries are involved in that. Do we know why the Egyptians chose to use of all things a feather in this most important moment when the soul is judged? Why that symbol? What's the mystery there? A feather of all things. Do we know, for instance, that there's not just 12 constellations in the zodiac, but at least 88? And do we know that those constellations, almost all of them, appear in the corporate world, in logos and images and corporate advertisements? Like I said earlier, two things fused together. Now, you may not know what those constellations are, so you probably wouldn't recognize it. But what happens if the advertisers are drawing upon that kind of esoteric knowledge? Do we know, for instance, that the temples of the Nile were actually designed to correspond to the 7 or more, but 7 basic centers that are known as the chakras of the human body, that the Nile was literally a manifestation on earth of the human form, which then was later picked up by other architects in the phi ratio that even modern temples from the time of Greece and Rome was based on, but that this concept was very much evidenced in Egypt, where the entire Nile Valley was based on the subtle centers of the body, and that as you ascended through the temples from the lowest in Upper Egypt to Lower Egypt, to the Delta, you were actually simulating the movement of the Kundalini towards enlightenment. Or that the cards of the tarot, which many people have tried to crack the mystery of that the earliest references are found in megalithic Ireland. Absolutely, that the wand, the sword, and the disc and the cup are mentioned in the earliest Irish mythologies as being the 4 treasures of Ireland. Or that the famous sword of Arthur, Excalibur, for instance, is actually based again on the sword of a very ancient Irish king. And that sword, it's almost like something out of science fiction, would vibrate in the presence of evil, just like we've seen so many fiction works. And that if it ever left the king's side, then he would perish. But if he kept the sword near him, just like you see later on in the Arthurian legend, no evil could harm him. And that the sword had the power to vanquish enemies not only of this world, the physical world, but could help him fight in other dimensions. Do we know, for instance, that the ancient name of Ireland, which was Scota, and then later Scotland, is actually the name of an Egyptian princess, the daughter of Akhenaten, no less? Do most Irish people know that? Do we know that the so-called Pillars of Hercules, which meant to have led the way, you see, to famous Atlantis, are not in the Straits of Gibraltar, but in Northern Ireland, and they're known as the Giant's Causeway? And that for thousands of years, mariners who went between those pillars, because there was some on Scotland's side and some on Ireland's side, said we are passing through the pillars of the giants. In Ireland, not Malta, not Gibraltar, not in the Mediterranean. What does that do to change history? Do you know, for instance, that the famous stone of Jacob that he rested his head on when he had the dream about the ladder ascending to heaven,